Okay, let's read another Rambler by Dr. Samuel Johnson. This is Rambler number 36 for Saturday, July 21st, 1750. The title of which is The Reason Why Pastorals Delight. I think he means, doesn't he mean pastoral like paintings? I don't know, find out. There's some Greek, which I can't read, by Homer, and then a quote. Piping on their heels, the shepherds go, now nor fear an ambush, nor suspect a foe. One more time. Piping on their reeds, not their heels. It's hard, no light. So, piping on their reeds, the shepherds go, nor fear an ambush, nor suspect a foe. Pope. There is scarcely any species of poetry that has allured more readers or excited more writers than the pastoral. It is generally pleasing because it entertains the mind with representations of scenes familiar to almost every imagination, and of which all can equally judge whether they are well described. It exhibits a life to which we have been always accustomed to associate peace and leisure and innocence, and therefore we readily set upon the heart for the admission of its images, which contribute to drive away cares and perturbations, and suffer ourselves, without resistance, to be transported to Elysian regions, where we are to meet with nothing but joy, and plenty, and contentment, where every gale whispers pleasure, and every shade promises repose. It has been maintained by some who love to talk of what they do not know, that pastoral is the most ancient poetry, and indeed, since it is probable that poetry is nearly of the same antiquity with rational nature, and since the life of the first men was certainly rural, we may reasonably conjecture that, as their ideas would necessarily be borrowed from those objects with which they are acquainted, their composers, being filled chiefly with such thoughts on the visible creation as must occur to the first observers, were pastoral hymns, like those which Milton introduces, the original pair singing in the day of innocence to the praise of their Maker. For the same reason that pastoral poetry was the first employment of the human imagination, it is generally the first literary amusement of our minds. We have seen fields and meadows and groves from the time that our eyes opened upon life, and are pleased with birds and brooks and breezes much earlier than we engage among the actions and passions of mankind. We are therefore delighted with rural pictures because we know the original at an age when our curiosity can be very little awakened by descriptions of courts which we never beheld, or representations of passions which we never felt. The satisfaction received from this kind of writing not only begins early, but lasts long. We do not, as we advance into the intellectual world, throw it away among other childish amusements and pastimes, but willingly return to it in any hour of indolence and relaxation. The images of true pastoral have always the power of exciting delight, because the works of nature from which they are drawn have always the same order and beauty, and continue to force themselves upon our thoughts, being at once obvious to the most careless regard, and more than adequate to the strongest reason and severest contemplation. Our inclination to stillness and tranquility is seldom much lessened by long knowledge of the busy and tumultuary part of the world. In childhood, we turn our thoughts to the country, as to the region of pleasure. We recur to it in old age as a port of rest, and perhaps with the secondary and adventitious gladness which every man feels on reviewing those places or recollecting those occurrences that contributed to his youthful enjoyments, and bring him back to the prime of his life, when the world was gay with the bloom of novelty, when mirth wantoned at his side, and hope sparkled before him. The sense of this universal pleasure has invited numbers without number to try their skill in pastoral performances, in which they have generally succeeded, after the manner of other imitators, transmitting the same images in the same combination from one to another, till he that reads the title of a poem may guess at the whole series of the composition. Nor will a man, after a perusal of thousands of those performances, find his knowledge enlarged with a single view of nature, not produced before, or his imagination amused with any new application of those views to moral purposes. The range of pastoral is indeed narrow, for though nature itself, philosophically considered, is inexhaustible, yet its general effects on the eye and on the ear are uniform and incapable of much variety of description. Poetry cannot dwell upon the minuter distinctions by which one species differs from another without departing from that simplicity of grandeur which fills the imagination, nor dissect the latent qualities of things without losing its general power of gratifying every mind by recalling its conceptions. However, as each age makes some discoveries, and those discoveries are by degrees generally known as new plants or modes of culture are introduced, and by little and little become common, pastoral might receive from time to time small augmentations and exhibit once in a century a scene somewhat varied. Both pastoral subjects have been often, like others, taken into the hands of those that were not qualified to adorn them, men to whom the face of nature was so little known that they have drawn it only after their own imagination, and changed or distorted her features, that their portraits might appear somewhat more than servile copies from their predecessors. Not only the images of rural life, but the occasions on which they can be properly produced are few and general. The state of a man confined to the employments and pleasures of the country is so little diversified and exposed to so few of those accidents which produce perplexities, terrors, and surprises in more complicated transactions, that he can be shown but seldom in such circumstances as attract curiosity. His ambition is without policy, and his love without intrigue. He has no complaints to make of his rival, but that he is richer than himself, nor any disasters to lament, but a cruel mistress or a bad harvest. The conviction of the necessity of some new source of pleasure induced Sazyrazes to remove the scene from the fields to the sea, to substitute fishermen for shepherds, and derive his sentiments from the piscatory life, for which he has been censured by succeeding critics, because the sea is an object of terror, and by no means proper to amuse the mind, and lay the passions asleep. Against this objection he might be defended by the established maxims that the poet has a right to select his images, and is no more obliged to show the sea in a storm than the land under an inundation, but may display all the pleasures and conceal the dangers of water, as he may lay his shepherd under a shady beech without giving him an ague or letting a wild beast loose upon him. There are, however, two defects in the piscatory eclogue, which perhaps cannot be supplied. The sea, though in hot countries it is considered by those who live like Sanasazurus upon the coast as a place of pleasure and diversion, has notwithstanding much less variety than the land, and therefore will be sooner exhausted by a descriptive writer. When he has once shown the sun rising or setting upon it, curled its waters with the vernal breeze, rolled the waves in gentle succession to the shore, and enumerated the fish sporting in the shallows, he has nothing remaining but what is common to all other poetry, the complaint of a nymph for a drowned lover, or the indignation of a fisher that his oysters are refused, and mycons accepted. His oysters are refused, and mycons accepted. Another obstacle to the general reception of this kind of poetry is the ignorance of maritime pleasures, in which the greater part of mankind must always live. To all the inland inhabitants of every region, the sea is only known as an immense diffusion of water over which men pass from one country to another, and in which life is frequently lost. They have therefore no opportunity of tracing in their own thoughts the description of winding shores and calm bays, nor can look on the poem in which they are mentioned with other sensations than on a sea chart or the metrical geography of Dionysus. This defect Sanazarius was hindered from perceiving by writing in a learned language to readers generally acquainted with the works of nature. But if he had made his attempt in any vulgar tongue, he would soon have discovered how vainly he had endeavored to make that loved which was not understood. I am afraid it will not be found easy to improve the pastorals of antiquity by any great additions or diversifications. Our descriptions may indeed differ from those of Virgil, as in English from an Italian summer, and in some respects as modern from ancient life. But his nature is in both countries nearly the same, and his poetry has to do rather with the passions of men, which are uniform, than their customs, which are changeable. The varieties which time or place can furnish will be inconsiderable, and I shall endeavor to show in the next paper how little the latter ages have contributed to the improvement of the rustic muse. Very nice.